Hello and welcome back to the lesson. Today we are going to study the evolution of corporate governance. The evolution of corporate governance. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to highlight some of the key milestones in the evolution of corporate governance, starting from the 17th century to date. From 17th century to date. Now, the evolution of corporate governance is a complex and an ongoing process that has been shaped by various historical, economical, and social factors. And this evolution reflects the changing dynamics between corporations, shareholders, stakeholders, and the general society. So the first key milestone is what happened in the 17th to 18th century. That is the evolution of corporate governance. We have the early corporations in the 17th to 18th century. Early corporations. It's important to remember there was a time when there were no corporations. Then there came a time when we had corporations. So we are here talking about the early corporations in the 17th, this is 17th to 18th centuries. Early corporations. Now, the concept of corporate governance emerged with the rise of joint stock companies in the 17th and the 18th centuries. These early corporations were often characterized by centralized ownership and limited accountability to the external shareholders and stakeholders. These are the early corporations. They were characterized by centralized ownership and limited accountability to the stakeholders. Characterized by centralized ownership, characterized by centralized ownership and the limited accountability to the stakeholders. So that is very key milestone, is a key milestone, early corporations. Then we evolved to the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. This is the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution began happening in the 19th century that led to the growth of large-scale corporations. Because of revolution in manufacturing, there came about large corporations with the dispersed ownership. Right? This was characterized with large corporations with dispersed ownership. The early corporations were characterized by centralized ownership. Here, the ownership is dispersed. All right? There came about large corporations with dispersed ownership structures. And the separation of ownership and management or control raised concerns about agency problems and the need for effective governance mechanisms to align the interests of the managers on one hand and the shareholders on the other hand. So here ownership was centralized. It was in the hands of the owners. Management was in the hands of the owners. But with the large corporations, then ownership and management was divorced. Those who managed were not necessarily the ones who owned. So there were dispersed ownership structures, so that such that the managers did not control the company. Ownership and control was separated in the 19th century with industrial revolution. You understand? And that gave rise to what we know today as the agency problem, because the management then began by not paying attention to the interests of the shareholders but their own interests, which gave rise to agency problems, which we will be discussing in our next topic on the governance structures. We will have a look at the agency problems. So this is the Industrial Revolution. Then we evolved to the 20th century, where we had the rise of managerial capitalism. Rise of managerial capitalism. The rise of managerial capitalism in the early 20th century. The early 20th century, there was rise of managerial capitalism, where professional managers became increasingly powerful and independent from shareholders. And that led to calls for greater accountability and transparency in corporate governance. So the rise of managerial capitalism is characterized by an increase in professional managers who became powerful and independent. Powerful. It was characterized by powerful professional managers who became independent from the shareholders. Powerful professional managers who became independent of the shareholders. Powerful professional managers, right? Professional managers became increasingly powerful and independent from the shareholders, which led to calls for greater accountability and transparency in corporate governance. That is early 20th century. And currently we are studying the evolution of the corporate governance. Corporate governance. Now, in the mid 20th century, number 4, the mid 20th century, we had what we call regulatory reforms. Regulatory reforms in the mid 20th century. Regulatory reforms. Now, the mid 20th century saw the introduction of various regulatory reforms aimed at strengthening corporate governance, such as, for example, in the United States, we had the Securities Act that was enacted. There is the the, the, the Securities Exchange Act that was also enacted around 1930 there. And these reforms focused on increasing disclosure and transparency, protection of investor rights, and preventing fraud. All right, it was characterized by increasing um, or focused on, you can say it focused on disclosure and transparency. Disclosure and transparency. Disclosure, there was focus on disclosure and transparency. There was also focus on protecting investors, protection of investors, because that is what every security exchange has to do, protect investors, and the laws that are put in place in relation to the Securities Act, and also the purpose is to prevent fraud. These are regulatory reforms in mid 20th century. Mid 20th century saw a focus on disclosure and transparency, protection of investors, and protection of fraud. That is mid 20th century. Then number 5, in the late 20th century, we saw an increase in corporate scandals. There was an increase in corporate scandals. Many companies went down in the late 20th century. We had scandals and crises. This is late 20th century. There was an increase of corporate scandals and crises that were witnessed, with several high-profile corporate scandals such as the Enron and the WorldCon, which collapsed, and that exposed the weaknesses of the existing governance systems. And such events, the events triggered a wave of new reforms and initiatives to improve corporate governance. So the scandals revealed weaknesses in the existing corporate governance structures. And as a result of this crisis and the scandals, then there was need again to develop reforms, to trigger a wave of new reforms, a wave of new initiatives in order to improve corporate governance practices. Fast forward to 21st century, we experience what we call globalization and CSR. Globalization and CSR, corporate social responsibility. That is the 21st century. 21st century, there is a globalization and corporate social responsibility. The 21st century has seen the rise of globalization and increased awareness of CSR, and companies are now expected to consider the impact of their actions on a wider range of stakeholders, including the customers, the employees, the suppliers, the environment, and so on. And that has led to the integration of the environmental, social, and governance factors. Environmental, social, and governance factors. Right? Environmental, social, and governance factors into the corporate governance framework. These factors have been incorporated into the corporate governance structures. All right? Incorporated in the corporate governance structures. That is the 21st century. Then 21st century to date, we now have what we call the digital transformation and emerging technologies. Digital transformation. At present, we have digital transformation, digital transformation, and emerging technologies. Digital transformation and emerging technologies. That is what we have at the present. Today. Is not so? Are we not experiencing digital transformation? The digital transformation and emergence of new technologies such as artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence today. And we have technologies like the blockchain, blockchain. Yes, blockchain. Technologies, artificial intelligence are creating new challenges and opportunities for corporate governance. And these technologies we know can enhance transparency and accountability, but they also raise concerns about data privacy. There are concerns about data security. We have algorithmic bias. There are challenges like algorithmic bias, cybersecurity challenges, privacy challenges, and so on. So that is where we are today. Digital transformation and emerging technologies in corporate governance. So this is a brief evolution of corporate governance, starting from the early corporations in the 17th century, which you have said were characterized by centralized ownership, meaning that the shareholders were the owners. The shareholders who are the owners were the managers. Control was centralized in the shareholders. But during Industrial Revolution, we had emergence of many companies which gave rise to large corporations with dispersed ownership, meaning that the ownership and control were separated. The control of the company was dispersed from the owners to the management. Then in the early 20th century, there was rise of managerial capitalism, where we had powerful professional managers who became independent of the shareholders. And this posed its own set of challenges that, for example, it gave rise to finding ways to deal with the agency problems that arose because of these powerful professional managers who became very independent. Then in the mid 20th century, we have seen the gave rise to regulatory reforms. There was need for more disclosure and transparency. There was also focus on protection of investors and prevention of fraud. In the late 20th century, witnessed several high-profile corporate scandals such as the Enron and the WorldCom, which collapsed, and that exposed the weaknesses of the existing governance systems that triggered a wave of new reforms and initiatives to improve corporate governance. That is the late 20th century. Now, in the 21st century, we witnessed globalization and corporate social responsibility, and we saw the environmental social factors being incorporated in corporate governance structures. Right? Companies are now expected to consider the impact of their actions on a wider range of stakeholders, including the environment, the customers, the employees, and so on. And that has led to integration of environmental, social, and 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 governance factors into corporate governance structures. Then lastly, at the present, we are dealing with digital transformation and emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, blockchain, and so on. And we've seen that these technologies can enhance transparency and accountability, but they also have their own set of challenges like cybersecurity, data security, algorithmic bias, and so on. So, candidates, the evolution of corporate governance is an ongoing process that is constantly adapting to new challenges, adapting to new opportunities. And as the global business landscape continues to evolve, corporate governance we need to also evolve as well in order to ensure that companies are operating in a responsible, transparent, and in a sustainable manner. So that is the end of the lesson on evolution of corporate governance. I will read to you today's assignment on the evolution of corporate governance. 1. How has the concept of corporate governance evolved over the past century? 2. What were the major corporate scandals that triggered reforms in corporate governance practices? 3. How have globalization and technological advances influenced the evolution of corporate governance? 4. What role have international organizations played in shaping modern corporate governance standards? That is question 4. Then another question: what are some of the ethical considerations that arise with the use of emerging technologies in corporate governance? That is question 5. What are some of the ethical considerations that arise with the use of emerging technologies in corporate governance? Thank you for attending the lesson. In our next session, we are going to study new models for corporate governance and ethics. Bye.